Hi guys, and welcome back to the Crochet Tour YouTube channel. In today's video I'm bringing you another new episode of TOR TRIES, and in this video I'll be reviewing Pokémon Crochet 2, which is a new crochet book that just came out. So this is what the book looks like. And if you've been around on my channel for a while, then you'll know that I've already done a review of the first book, so the first Pokémon Crochet book, but yeah, the second iteration just came out very recently. I think it was just in February this year, so yeah, I thought I'd get a review out as quickly as I could, and I've tested out a few patterns in this, so now I feel like I can give quite a fair review of what I think about this book. One thing to note about these two books as well is that they're written or designed by two different people. So the first one was designed by Sabrina Summers, but this second book is designed by Lee Sartori. So they did decide to go with a different crochet designer in the second book, but I'll get into sort of the impact that that's had on the book later on in my review. So as always, my review is going to kind of be split into a few different main sections. So the first section I'm going to talk about the book, the second section I'm going to talk about the designer, the third section I'm going to show you what I've made from the book, then I'll talk about what I liked and what I disliked about the book and the patterns in the book, and then I'll give my overall conclusion and as recommendation as to whether I would recommend that you buy this or not. So yeah, if you're interested in finding out more about Pokémon Crochet 2, then keep watching. So the book itself was published in February 2023, so as I previously mentioned, it was published really recently, only just like a month or so ago. So you can get it at any sort of popular online bookshops like Amazon, Book Depository, Waterstones. I'm sure it's available in many different countries and probably in whatever sort of online shops are popular in your country, but you can just do a quick Google search to find where it's available in your country. I pre-ordered it on Amazon personally, so I got it pretty much immediately as it came out, and I paid about £12 for it, and I think it's still around £12, so I don't think the price has significantly changed in the last month. And in terms of the number of patterns that you get 20 in the book. It does say that on the front as well, it says here, and you get 20 in the first book as well, so they kept that consistent between the two books, and that means that you're paying less than £1 per pattern, so that's really good value in my opinion. Then in terms of the pattern difficulty levels, so in Pokémon Crochet 2 there are 5 beginner patterns, there's 8 intermediate, and then there's 7 advanced. Now that difficulty spread does match the first book, but they do call the difficulty levels something slightly different across the two books. So in Pokémon Crochet 2, as I mentioned, it goes from beginner to intermediate to advanced, whereas in the first Pokémon Crochet book it goes from I think it's beginner, then easy, and then intermediate. So there's a slight change in the sort of terminology and how they're calling each of the different difficulty levels across the two books. So I think what you can conclude there is probably that the patterns in book 2 are meant to be a bit more advanced than the first book, and I would probably say that that is correct based on the patterns that I've sampled in the book so far. So I would say that, like, on the whole, the patterns in the second book are a bit more challenging and advanced than the patterns in book number 1. Then in terms of the stitches that are used in the book, because this is amigurumi, it is mainly, again, just your normal single crochets, increases, decreases, and slip stitches. There might be some patterns where there's some other stitches used, like double crochets and things like that. I can't quite remember from the patterns I did, but again, I think it was, you know, fairly standard crochet stitches, nothing that I needed to look up or work out what to do. But helpfully they do put stitch explanations in the front of the book as well, so I didn't personally read that bit because I didn't need it, so I can't really give you a review on that, but I'm sure it's probably sufficient to explain to you how to do any stitches that you might not know how to do, and if not, then there's always tons of YouTube videos, so you can just look up the stitch and watch a video of someone doing it instead. So for a bit of background on the designer, again, as I mentioned, she's called Lee Sartori. I think she's Canadian, or she at least lives in Canada from what I could see when I looked her up. Again, it also looks like crochet is her full-time job, so I think she's been on TV shows and done some other bits and pieces relating to crochet, so that seems to be, like I say, her full-time job. And when I looked her up, I noticed she also has a few other books available. So I think she has a Harry Potter crochet book and then also a Friends crochet book. So it seems like she quite likes doing crochet books relating to characters that already exist, maybe, rather than creating her own characters, although she may have patterns with her own characters as well. I didn't actually check that out. And if you want to find out more about her, then she is on Instagram, and she does have quite a lot of followers as well. She has over 100,000, so yeah, clearly she's quite a well-known crochet designer. So now let's get into what I've made from this book. So I tried 3 patterns in total, so I did one from the beginner, one from the intermediate and one from the advanced level, just so that I could get a broad spread and sort of understand how difficult those levels actually are and just give a fair review of the book. So one thing I want to mention before I show you what I've made is that the book does call for a 1.5mm crochet hook and sport weight yarn, or sock weight, or whatever you want to call it, which that is quite unusual, to be honest, for amigurumi patterns and not something that I see very often. So I was a bit surprised when I saw that in the book, and we'll get on to talking more about that later on. But one thing I wanted to mention is that, you know what I'm like, I'm very stubborn and I don't like following instructions in terms of the yarn weight and the hook size most of the time. I just do whatever I want. So I ended up doing a 3.5mm crochet hook with Aran weight yarn. Normally I would use a 4mm, but because these patterns were written for such a significantly smaller weight of yarn and crochet hook size, I decided that 4 would probably just come out way too big, and to be fair, with the 3.5 they still came out really big, especially one of them you'll see in a second. So yeah, I just wanted to tell you that, because obviously if you follow the instructions in the book, yours aren't going to come out anywhere near as big as mine, so just bear that in mind when you're looking at what I've created. But if you want the big look on your ones as well, then you might want to sort of copy the same thing, or maybe even just sizing up to DK and maybe a 2.5 to 3mm crochet hook if you don't want to go all the way to Aran weight with a 3.5mm. But anyway, without further ado, let's actually show you what I've made. So from the beginner section, I made Munchlax. So as you can see, I mean, just compare him to the size of me, he's absolutely massive. This was the biggest one out of the 3, so yeah, like some of the rounds got up to over 100 single crochets in the round, which I never do things that are that big, and obviously that's because it was written for using a smaller crochet hook and a lighter weight of yarn. But yep, this is what mine came out like. Then from the intermediate level I did Sylveon. So I really like this one, and this one didn't come out like enormous, so it came out kind of like a normal size for what I like in terms of the size of my amigurumi pieces. So yeah, I was really happy with this one. And then the final one, which I think is the best out of the 3, is Cubone. So this was the advanced level, one of the advanced level patterns, and this is what he looks like. I honestly really love this one, and I actually did a TikTok video on this one and it got like over 1 million views, so clearly other people really like this one as well. But yeah, that's my Cubone. So those are the 3 that I did from the book. So if we start off with things that I did like about the book, the first couple of things that were also the same in book 1, but I just wanted to reiterate that the sort of consistency remained the same in book 2, and these were still good points of the second book as well. So the first thing I like is that the patterns tell you exactly how many grams of each yarn you'll be needing, and it also tells you exactly what brand of yarn and what colour she used as well. So if you did want to exactly replicate what she's managed to do in the book, then you could go out and buy the exact yarn that she used in the exact quantities, and you wouldn't have to worry about whether you had too much or too little, or also whether you had the right colours as well. So I do like that they give that level of detail. Obviously, as you've already seen, I completely ignored any yarn recommendations and just used what I felt like using, but I do think that is helpful for people that are maybe a bit more beginner and might need to stick to the pattern a bit more closely than someone who's more experienced and can, you know, make it work with whatever they have in their stash. I also like that, again, it provides you with kind of templates for the felt pieces as well that you're going to need to cut out, so it's always useful to see those just on a template rather than only seeing the picture of the felt like as it's stuck down on the piece, if that makes any sense. So I do quite like that those templates were also included in book number 2. Then sort of new points, so things that are different in book 2 compared to book 1 that I did really like. The main thing is really just that I think the actual Pokemon that they've chosen to do the patterns for in book 2 are a lot more interesting than book 1. So if you're really tired of like Pikachu and Eevee and things like that, then I do think that there's a lot more variety in book 2, and there's some more interesting Pokemon that you maybe wouldn't see patterns for normally. Like, I think Cubone is a really good example of that, and that was quite, I imagine that was a really difficult one for her to design as well. So yeah, if you want some slightly more different Pokemon, then I think you can get that in book 2. Another thing I liked about the book is that, look, we'll come on to some things that I didn't like about the book in a second, and we'll talk about that, but obviously you can see that overall the free like Pokemon that I ended up making, they did come out really nicely. Like, you can't deny that those were really good designs. So like, I do think that, again, we'll get onto this, and I think that you maybe need to be a bit more advanced in your crochet experience to be able to sort of replicate what she's done in the book, but I do think that overall the patterns were well designed, and there were some quite complicated patterns and quite challenging designs in there, like Cubone, for example, which I'm really impressed with how she managed to pull that off. So yeah, that's another really good thing about the book. So now we'll move on to things that I didn't like about the book. I've got to be fair and tell you my honest opinion. So the first thing that I didn't like is just the inconsistency with the hook size and the yarn used in both books. So I just really don't like that the second book used a 1.5mm crochet hook and sport or sock weight yarn, because it just means that if you don't follow that and you go with whatever you have, then it's going to come out quite a lot bigger than what is in the book. And I just, like, I'll show you an example of what I'm trying to say by this. So in the first book I created the Snorlax and I used a 4mm crochet hook with my Aran weight yarn, and then if you compare that to the Munchlax that I just showed you, like, I just don't, like, Munchlax shouldn't really be bigger than Snorlax, and I even used a slightly smaller crochet hook for the Munchlax. I used a 3.5 instead of a 4, and it just came out significantly bigger. So I know that if you would have followed what she said and you used a 1.5 for the Munchlax and a 2.5 for the Snorlax, then you would have probably ended up with a bigger Snorlax than the Munchlax. But I just think realistically most people probably don't have sport or sock weight yarn in their stash either, so anyone that wants to follow that book to a T is going to have to probably go out and buy all of that stuff. Again, like, I guess you could have just sized up to DK and a slightly bigger hook size, and again, you maybe wouldn't have had the same size discrepancy that I have here, but I just wish they would have made it a bit clearer somewhere that it wasn't going to be consistent in terms of the hook size and the yarn used, because I do think that makes a big difference. And yeah, it probably would have been something that would have been nice to know, rather than just seeing that when you open up the book and realising, okay, these two books that are in the same series aren't actually really consistent at all in that respect. Another thing as well was that, if I'm being honest, there were quite a lot of errors in the patterns that I did. So I only did 3 patterns in the book, and all of them had some level of errors in, which is a bit disappointing really, especially because of the first book being such high quality, and like, you wanted to kind of maintain that standard, but I do feel like the standard did slip a little bit in the second book in that respect. So I can give some specific examples for that. On the Munchlax, for example, there were no sewing instructions for the feet. So again, like, I could obviously figure out what needed to be done there, and most people could probably figure it out, but it's just a bit, I don't know, it's just a bit disappointing that that was missing from the book. On Sylveon, there were some mistakes, I think, in one of the rounds for the forelegs. So I think they had got the colours wrong in terms of like which colour you should be using in round 6. So I did it once, I did it wrong, and I realised, I was like, this doesn't look right, and then I had to think about it, and I was like, okay, I see what they've done there. I think they've mixed the colours up by accident, so where it said to use white, it should have been pink, and vice versa. So again, I was able to figure it out, but it did waste a little bit of my time, and I think that beginners or even intermediate people might not have figured out what was going on with that pattern and might have just ended up with legs that looked a bit funny. So yeah, that was the issue that I noticed in Sylveon. And then in Cubone, there were unfortunately quite a lot of different things going on with that pattern, which I guess kind of makes sense because it's the more complicated one out of all of them. So if there were going to be errors, that's probably the one where they would be. So some of the things I noticed were there were like just a few spelling mistakes, and I know that's really minor, but you would have thought that someone would have read over the book and corrected any spelling mistakes. They weren't even crochet related words, some of them, so even someone that's not in the crochet world should have been able to like proofread that book and spot those mistakes. So again, didn't really affect my understanding, but it just I don't know, it's just a little bit sloppy, I think. And then a couple of the other things I noticed on Cubone were there were some missing conclusions from some of the steps. So like when you would crochet a piece, it wouldn't always tell you whether you needed to leave a long yarn tail for sewing or whether you just needed to fasten off. So you had to kind of make guesses. I would just leave a tail where I wasn't sure, just to be on the safe side. But again, someone that's a beginner might not know to do that, and then they might end up, you know, not having a yarn tail to sew with, and then have to, you know, cut a piece of yarn and incorporate it in, and it just makes their life a lot more complicated when they could have just been told what to do in the first place. Then also there was some name changing as well, so some of the pieces were called a certain name in the crochet instructions, but then when it came to the sewing they'd be called something completely different. On Cubone, actually, the main issue where I had that was on the teeth pieces. So I've got to be honest, I'm not even sure if I did it properly in the end. Like, I didn't really understand the instructions and I couldn't work out what they were referring to when they were talking about sewing the teeth pieces down. So I just did my best guess based on what Cubone looks like, but this might not even be like correct because I couldn't tell from the pattern, honestly. And then there were just some parts of the sewing instructions that were missing, it feels like, as well. So I'm pretty sure in the instructions they didn't tell you to sew down these eye sockets, because if you didn't know, this is double layered, so you create two pieces and then sew them together. But before, like when I had finished it, there was just this gap between the two pieces for the eye sockets, so I just had to go in and sew them down because it just looked horrible having that open, and it wasn't a step that was included in the sewing instructions at all. So again, you're kind of having to interpret a lot of the stuff in this book to work out what they're trying to get you to do. And I don't know, like, again, advanced people can probably do that, but if you're a beginner or intermediate, I can see that you might get quite frustrated with some of the patterns in this book. So yeah, that was one of the other things I didn't like. And then the final thing that I disliked was that the sewing instructions, I kind of touched on this, but the sewing instructions were quite vague and hard to follow sometimes. So sometimes she did tell you which rounds to sew things to, and that was really helpful when it was included, but it just wasn't always included, and sometimes some of the sewing instructions just seemed to be completely omitted from the pattern, which wasn't the most helpful and would be quite difficult for an inexperienced crocheter to follow. So after having said all that, would I recommend that you buy Pokémon Crochet 2? Well, I kind of have a mixed opinion on it, to be honest. I think I would recommend it to certain groups of people. So I'd recommend it to anyone that's done all of the patterns in the first book and they want to try some new ones. I'd definitely recommend it to you. I'd recommend it to anyone that's more of an advanced level crocheter and is okay with the fact that you are going to have to make some of your own interpretations on some of the patterns, and you're kind of okay with the fact that there's going to be some errors that you're going to have to figure out by yourself. Then I'd recommend it to you, because I think that the base patterns themselves are really good. And like I say, the Cubone, for example, I wouldn't have known how to even approach doing this skull here, so you do learn some new techniques in there, even though there are some errors and omitted information scattered around in the patterns. I would recommend this book to anyone that does happen to have loads of sport or sock weight yarn that they want to make use of. This would be the perfect opportunity to use that. And I would also recommend this to anyone that thinks that the patterns that are in the first book are a little bit boring. So like I say, Pikachu and the standard starters that probably have 100 different patterns available online for them, and you want some slightly different character selections, then I think the second book is probably more appropriate for you than the first book. But overall, like, I think it's pretty clear from what I've already said in this video, but I do think that book 1 is a lot more superior to the second book. It's higher quality and it's just easier to follow for beginners, I think. And I just feel like it's been proofread better and like the patterns have been properly tested. I don't quite know, to be honest, like what happened really with the second book. I'm imagining what happened is that they really rushed to try and get a second book out when they saw how popular the first book was, and there just wasn't the time taken for people to test the patterns and to also proofread the book itself just in general and correct spelling mistakes and things like that. So yeah, I do think it's a bit of a shame. I think if a bit more time would have been spent on the second book, then it could have been a higher quality, but you know, it's still a good book, and as I said before, like I think it's even less than 50p per pattern. It's still like really cheap, and you can't really complain too much when it's that cheap, that there might be some mistakes and things missing. I mean, I know that my patterns aren't perfect either, but I guess my patterns are free, so that is the slight difference there. But you know, I still think it's a really good book. I would still recommend it, but I do think that you should start with book number 1 first, and then if you feel like you want to do more, then probably progress to the second book after you've done everything that you want to do in the first one. So yeah, that's pretty much going to wrap up my video, and I have checked the Amazon reviews for the second book as well. I did check them after I'd already written down all of my points that I wanted to say, just to make sure that I wasn't swayed by other people's opinions, but I think at the moment it is sat at around 4.5 stars, so clearly most people do really like it. I have, however, found some more detailed reviews from people similar to me that were a little bit disappointed in some of the mistakes and errors that weren't spotted in the book before it was released. So yeah, I think there's quite a few people that would share the same sort of mixed opinion that I've had in this video. But yeah, that's going to wrap up today's video. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If there's any more books that you want me to review, just leave it down below. I still have loads that I need to review, to be honest. I'm still working through. I always want to make sure that I, you know, at least try 1 or 2 patterns from the book so that I can give it a fair review. I don't want to review something that I haven't properly tried. So yeah, it does take me a little bit of time to get to everything, but there'll be more book reviews to come in future, I'm sure. So yeah, that's it. Thanks, guys.